It's my pleasure to introduce Linda Merigliano, our next speaker. I'm Jeff Mazer, working also on the Science and Data Committee. Linda is the Recreation and Wilderness Program Manager for the Bridger Teton National Forest. Her job, amongst many other duties, involves just that, balancing a fast-growing and very active population's desire for recreation in the mountains with the principles of wilderness and land protection. Sound familiar? We wanted to hear of her experiences managing recreation in and around the Jackson area, including the Palisades Wilderness Study Area, partly because the similarities in our wilderness recreation conflicts, but also because the area she manages represents the southern reaches of the Yellowstone ecosystem. Some of the same issues of wild, rare, and endangered species exist there as well as here. Please welcome our guest, Linda Merigliano.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and in many ways, Bozeman and Jackson are sister or brother cities. So I think there's an awful lot of similarity between the lifestyle and the culture of the two places. Although I have to say Jackson in Teton County is quite a bit smaller, but our summer population swells significantly. So we're still dealing with an awful lot of recreation use. And I just want to set a little bit of the context here, and a couple things as we go through some real key kind of events that happened in the last 15 years. And so 2000, 2001, I'll start there, but we reprinted our travel management travel plan for visitors because we just didn't have any to give out to people. The Palisades Wilderness Study Area was shown as closed to summer motorized use except for those areas that were in existence, like roads and things that were open to motorized travel prior to the legislation that had designated that area. So that map got printed, and because we were starting to see user-created roads developing into the WSA. So the map, that was definitely not consistent with the legislation, and so the map was reprinted showing that differently. Also, in 2001, we started the partnership with Friends of Pathways, and it was an effort to try to look at getting people's, if we were going to address some of the recreation impacts, we might as well start in people's backyards. And so looking at the area that was right outside of Jackson in the Cache Game area, of trying to really engage the community on dealing with a whole bunch of user-created trails and figuring out how to transform that into a very usable trail system. And so we started that in 2001, and with some funding, actually Friends of Pathways hired a coordinator to do public meetings, and we got all the different groups together and came up with a little bit of a master plan for that area. So that really started us down the road. So we've been working on this for the last 15 years. 2004, because of some of the success that we were starting to see in the Cache Game area, people said, you know, you might want to look at Teton Pass. There's some real significant conflicts. And we were starting to see some illegal trail construction going on in that area, and particularly some of the horse riders. That there's a Trail Creek Ranch right at the base of Teton Pass, and because of these illegal trails, there were bikes coming down, intersecting a trail that was used by horses, and some really serious near misses. And it was like, from a Forest Service standpoint, like we can no longer ignore this situation. Somebody's going to get killed here. And so we started a series of public meetings, and a lot of when we started that was trying to find out. There was a guy who knew Teton Pass intimately, and everyone knew him in town, and he just went around one-on-one and just asking, if we brought people together in the same room, were they going to just scream and shout and and yell at each other, or were they willing to work together and think that we could work this out together? And what he learned in those just one-on-one informal conversations is people were willing, did say, you know, I think we can work this out, but it can't be all overlapping. And so that was really the genesis. We held a public meeting. There were downhill mountain bikers with ranch folks and everything, and it was, we had about 100 people show up, which was pretty big for Wilson, and it was really positive. And everybody ended up applauding at the end of the meeting. The forest supervisor was so impressed that people were willing to work together that she asked us to kind of fast track that decision. And that's why we got the Teton Pass Trail System fairly quickly. 2004 through 2006, right about that same time, was the final environmental impact statement and lawsuit around the heliskiing issue in the Palisades WSA. So that was going on at the same time. Definitely, there was starting to be a lot more scrutiny about the WSA at the same time. 2006 through 2009, after the National Travel Management Rule was put into place in 2005, we started the travel planning for motorized summer travel and worked through that process. So that was 2006, 2009, and then 2012 through 2014, a huge issue arose over the WSA, and it really was about the boundary of the WSA. There's a unique thing in the Wyoming Wilderness Act that designated these areas that requires not only the designated wilderness, but the WSAs to have a certified boundary. And so the map that we were using for the WSA was disputed. And so it took 2 years to work through that process. And that's, some of the mountain bike issues got wrapped up in that issue. At the same time, we had put out a scoping document in 2011 for a trail right outside of Jackson, a new trail that would provide a real key connection along a ridge, and hotly contested over wildlife issues, and then just a concern about expanding mountain bike use and when is enough enough. And so we took a step back and did a district-wide trail assessment looking at the entire trail system for non-motorized uses too. And so that took a couple of years to complete, and then out of that, we've got now agreement on kind of how the trail system is going to get developed across the whole district. And in 2015, we just released yesterday a decision for this area outside of Jackson to try to pull some of this together. So, so those are just some key dates to keep in mind. But to set the context and give you a few visuals of what this area looks like is the Bridge of Teton National Forest. Every single forest, I think one of the things that's happening within the National Forest is that we are a multiple use agency, and our whole mission is trying to have sustainable uses, and certainly recreation and restoration are probably the two big focuses. But within that larger mandate, every single forest has its own identity. And it's based on its history and context. For the Bridge or Teton, we've always considered ourselves the WWW forest. Our focus is wildlife, and wildlife drives most of the decisions around us. Wild rivers, and winter recreation, and wildlands and wilderness and things. And so the forest is 3.4 million acres, and about, on the Jackson district, 92% of our district is in some kind of protected status. And so it does have a lot of the conservation values are really high, but mostly what draws people to Jackson is wildlife and outdoor recreation. So trying to find how to marry those two and not have those be divided is really critical. Our forest plan also reflects, our forest plan is from 1990, but it does reflect those values, very, very strong wildlife values. So we're working within that context. So next slide. So just to show a little bit, this is the Jackson area. So Jackson itself sits right here. So, or I'm sorry, right up here. And so Grove Wilderness right on the back. So, and then to the west, the Palisades Wilderness Study Area. And this is Teton Pass right here. So the Jedediah Smith Wilderness is up here, and then the whole Palisades Wilderness Study Area is the Snake River Range south. Again, it was designated as part of the Wyoming wilderness legislation that passed in 1984. All of these areas. So, next slide. So this is just a little bit the WSA. Each of the areas on the Jackson District have very, very unique character. And that's one of the things that when we were working with people is even within that area, each place has a very distinct personality and different patterns, different landforms. The Palisades Wilderness Study Area is extremely V-shaped canyons and pretty rugged terrain and things. It's not the rolling kind of stuff. The soils are not great, pretty muddy until you get up towards the Teton Pass area. And then you start to grade into the granitics and things that are part of the Teton Range. So this is Teton Pass, and so just a couple of orientation areas. So this is the main highway going through, and the Wilderness Study Area boundary is this black line is the old pass road, which was the original road over Teton Pass. And so the WSA boundary is just the stuff to the south here. This area here is all, it's not part of the wilderness, but it's adjacent to the Jedediah Smith Wilderness, which is over here. So that 2004 decision that I mentioned, one of the things that came out of that was a recognition that particularly with downhill mountain biking, that there was no way that you could have the same uses on the same trail. So we had to look at some kind of separated use. And so this is what resulted from that, is that the illegal trail construction was mostly happening in the WSA. And so it was some trails that were coming down off of these ridges. And as a result of that decision is that we said that we would allow this one trail to remain. The rest of the trails had to be closed. And then the concept that came out of it was that we would allow some of the downhill specific trails in the power line corridors that were already relatively disturbed and provide separated use. And so the yellow trails here, this is the original old wagon road, and so we call it the History Trail. And the Big Rocks Trail, this is where some of that conflict was occurring, near misses between bikes and horses, is that those trails would be designated for hike and horse only, and then the red trails for downhill biking would be designated bike only. And then the other trails here, we also at the same time made the trail to Ski Lake, which is probably the most popular trail for families and people going up with dogs and young kids. We made that hike and horse only and things, and it completely eliminated the mountain bike trespass in the Jed Smith Wilderness. So it's worked really, really well. And so that's just a little bit of the context. Here, a couple of pictures of some of what the trails look like. The 2004 decision was made about experimenting with a separated use, and then in 2008, it took 3 years of planning, but we were one of 5 forests in the nation that were selected to host the Aero Corps. So the Boy Scouts nationally said that they were going to have 5,000 scouts, and they were going to pick 5 forests and 1,000 scouts per forest. It took us 3 years to plan the projects, but we worked. We had to go back to Indiana, and they trained all their leaders. The Boy Scout leaders led the projects, but we had some projects up in the Grovant, but the main focus for the Boy Scouts was on Teton Pass. And that's where, if you've ever been to Jackson and ridden the Arrow Trail, the Arrow Trail is a testament. The Boy Scouts built that trail for mountain biking. It's designed for mountain biking. It's on that north side of things, and it was completed in 3.5 days. But it took a whole lot of planning to get to that point. And it became, the buzz of building a truly sustainable trail. I think that we started to see a turning point of where people could see that maintaining trails and doing quality trails was more than just clearing trees. That real attention to design and flow and all of that was important. And so this just shows, this is a piece of the history trail that was the Montana Conservation Corps that helped out with that project, and then the Boy Scouts finished it. And so the Boy Scouts did 2 trails that were more designed for mountain biking and 2 trails that were horse and hike, and reconstructed all of that. And then this is just a picture of some of these. This is the Powerline Jumps Trail, and Fuzzy Bunny. They get to name all their trails, so they come up with fairly unique names. But again, a huge partnership with Friends of Pathways. Friends of Pathways hires the trail crew members to maintain a lot of the trails, and then Teton Freedom Riders is part of the decision that came out of the 2004 was that we said we would only adopt these downhill mountain bike trails if an organization formed that would make a commitment to maintaining the trails and monitoring because of the risk that's associated, some of that, making sure the signing's in place and all of that kind of stuff. So that's Teton Freedom Riders formed because of the decision that we had made. And I would say that the feedback on Teton Pass is that separated use thing is working pretty well. Is we don't see much conflict, and people seem to be pretty happy with it. So. Okay, so 2006, we started this was for the motorized, for the North Zone. And again, one of the things that here is that when the National Travel Management Rule passed in 2005, one of the provisions is that it was no longer acceptable to have areas that were just open to cross-country motorized travel. It had to be on designated routes. So then the question became, those areas that are still open, what does a designated route system look like? And one of the things that I think that has become a really key thing in looking at trails is who are you really trying to serve in these spots? And so we had trails, there was a lot of conflict that was starting to develop, not only between hunters in the fall and the motorized community, but also between motorcyclists and ATV thing, is that we were seeing a lot of motorcycle trails, or single track trails that were formerly horse trails, turning into motorcycle trails, turning into ATV trails, turning into full-size truck trails. And that transformation wasn't serving, there was starting to be a lot of conflict within the motorized community. So the question of what's really best suited, and that's one of the things that we're required to do under the National Travel Rule is what are the routes, what's the class of vehicle that is going to be served, and what's the season of use. So these kind of orange areas were the areas that were still open to cross-country motorized travel prior to that, and it was the whole Gros-Ventre corridor, which is hugely important for wildlife. Shadow Mountain, Black Rock, Togety, which is a huge concentration area for bears, and then the Munger Mountain area, Hoback Basin, and then some of that Phillips Ridge area just north of Teton Pass and the Mosquito Creek area. So those were the areas, and the leadership team had very clear direction that they wanted us to be very focused in our effort, and so we did not take on the world here. Is one of the things that we did was just focus on summer motorized travel and only in these areas that still had unrestricted use. And it was very place-based. So what does a system look like in the Gros-Ventre? What should a system look like in Munger? So this is what resulted from that. And one of the decisions that came out of it, this is the Gros-Ventre corridor. So this Slate Creek, which used to be a road system, and people were, it's in a very big, there's big, huge willow complex and riparian areas, and people were having to chain up and winch trucks through some of the area. It was just getting hammered. And so we had started to kind of pull that back even in the late 90s after some really wet years. So that became kind of the ATV 50-inch trail opportunity. So there's a lot of folks that use the side-by-side razor on that trail, and it's all now been reconstructed with a partnership with Wyoming State Trails to pull all of those trails out of the riparian area and make them really sustainable. And some pictures of that. This area here in the horsetail was designated as, that was one of the areas that was turning from single track into ATV. People were rolling ATVs off of the hillsides and things, that became a motorcycle loop. And now there's a local group that interestingly saw the work that the Freedom Riders were doing on Teton Pass and said, if we come and help the Forest Service, can we get better trails? And so we started having them work to reconstruct this horsetail loop, which had some serious resource issues. And so it's now, much more quality. And we told people up front is that given the wildlife issues particularly in that Gros-Ventre corridor, there's no way we're going to be able to provide miles of trail, but what we can provide, we will bend over backwards to make it quality. And so we've been really working on that. One of the things that came out of this was a lot of the motorized use is associated with rental shops, of people coming to Jackson and wanting to rent ATVs and side-by-sides. And people were trying to go up the Gros-Ventre, and this trail here requires fording the Gros-Ventre River, which really scares a lot of people. And so, and people weren't able, a lot of folks couldn't read maps very well, and so they were getting lost. We took this Shadow Mountain area here, and this was a bunch of old logging roads, and created, just by looking at the old logging roads, created some loops there, and made those 50-inch trails. And so kind of shifted some of the use from the Gros-Ventre into the Shadow area. So it was a little closer to town, highly scenic. You get cell service, so if you get in trouble, you can call and everything. And that has been a real highlight. So that trail system, the Shadow Mountain Trail System, recently won the award for the Wyoming under the Wyoming Recreational Trail program as you know, one of the highlighted trail systems in the state. So this is just a few pictures of what some of that stuff looks like. One of the things that we did after the decision was made regarding these routes in 2009 is there was the number one issue we were hearing from the public was nobody believed that we were actually going to follow through and implement anything and do the monitoring. And so we have to hit the implementation really hard, and it's got to be really visible. And so right in 2009, after the decision was made, is that the strategy was we have to do an equal amount of trail improvement as we do closing some of the routes that were not part of the system. And so this is just some examples. This is that Shadow Mountain Trail System. This is one of the spots along the trail system that just looks out over the Tetons. This is Wyoming State Trails reconstructing some of that Slate Creek area. And this is that local motorcycle group, Dirt. They call themselves Dirt. Reconstructing some of the horsetail stuff and some bridges that had just completely collapsed. And then at the same time, working on restoring some of the bad routes. And GYC, Jackson Hole Wildlife Foundation sends out a group from the Beckett School. So they're inner city kids, and they come every year, and there's about 6 projects to restore different routes. And then Sierra Club has been involved in a lot of route restoration. So every year we have about 7 projects to make it easy for people to know where the routes that we want them to be on are and make sure that those are quality, and then at the same time get rid of the stuff on the ground that is not part of the system. So mentioned the trail system. Again, this was kind of an outgrowth of now looking at the non-motorized side of things and this concern about where are you really going. We have a lot of user-created trails, and particularly the demand in the front country. So that area that rings around Jackson, just tremendous pressures for more trails, more use-specific trails and things, and also a lot of concern about with the increasing recreation pressure, what is that doing to the wildlife populations, and definitely seeing grizzly bears expand rapidly into some of these areas. And then decreasing funding. Are we really spending our money in the right places? And so we decided to take a step back and look at the entire district. And it was driven partly by looking at what was the forest plan direction for some of these areas. That was a huge factor in that. And then, what are really understanding the different user group needs. Worked a lot with backcountry horsemen. From a day horse riding perspective, one of the things that we learned out of that is that some of the areas that we were thinking were going to be really good for day horse rides, they're like, nope, we can't pull a trailer up that road. And things, we need a pretty big, wide trailhead in order to pull a trailer around. A lot of people don't like to back trailers and things. And so, so it really, it's like, okay, that informs that, maybe some of the areas to the south, just south of Jackson, we can really set up for day horse riding opportunities. And that's kind of the best place. And versus the mountain biking, we're going to have to, if we're looking at the big picture, in order to protect these wild values, and things, we've got to be willing to concentrate use in some small areas. And that's this whole thing of, there's more and more literature of the idea of just trying to disperse, documented in the literature, that wildlife responds better if it's a predictable impact rather than a dispersed impact. And so, so the question then becomes, where are those places that we should focus that use? We've got to deal with it. And I think that one of the things that I'm really seeing change is that in these principles is that I think we're past the point where most people acknowledge that recreation has some impact. It's got to be managed. And one of the things that we've really focused on a lot is that there's no value in pointing fingers. Everyone saying, it's the mountain bikers that are causing all the problems. No, it's the hikers, it's the horses, it's the thing. All recreation creates some level of impact. There's different kinds of impact with all those different uses. But the more fundamental thing, particularly from a wildland value and wildlife standpoint, is that the differences in impact on wildlife disturbances are not so much from the type of use. It's the location of use, the timing of use, and the behavior of the users. And so we've got to get past pointing fingers at each other and more focused on where's the right location, what's the right time. We know that wildlife are way more sensitive in the winter times and the spring times, and that we need that fall security and things. And then from a use behavior standpoint, there's all kinds of things that we need to be really focused on in terms of particularly in bear country, with being alert and we're working a lot with trail runners and hikers and mountain bikers. Lose the earbuds. If you can't hear, you can't communicate, and things. And so there's a bunch of, just those kinds of behaviors are really emerging from some of the conversations that we're having right now, and it's really fun. Again, Bob mentioned this too. Is change is inevitable. I recognize it is so hard for people that have lived for generations in some of these areas to see the change that's happened right around Jackson in these front country areas is really hard to watch. It's like it's really heavy recreation use, and I know that change is hard to accept, but we've got to look at that broader landscape. It's gonna, with the growth that's happening, things are gonna change. It's up to us to collectively come together and figure out how to guide that change. And so, again, mentioned, focusing on common goals. One of the things that we've been really trying to harp on is we don't have bike trails or horse trails or hiker trails. We have, or motorized trails or things, is that all of us usually do multiple activities. We're not one thing. And so let's focus on being a trail community, not just one particular use. And again, not all areas have the same emphasis. We can't provide quality trails for every use in the same place. And so we've got to start being willing to look at who are we trying to serve in a particular location. And so I think the next slide will show the results of that. So we divided the Jackson Ranger District into 9 geographic locations. And each of them, again, has its own personality, and went through looking at what the user needs were, as well as what the forest plan direction was, and just some of the characteristics of the land. And the legislation for the WSA and the wilderness. And so each area now has its own emphasis. And this will be used to, we're using this as a screen when we get proposals for wanting to fix up a trail and things, is does it fit the guidelines and the emphasis that we have for the different areas. And our mantra has become the right use in the right location at the right time and things. But again, from the recreation standpoint, it does require this willingness to look at the whole area, not just the area right in the backyard and things. And that's a hard, I sympathize with that. That's a hard thing when everybody wants to do their favorite activity right next to town. And doesn't always happen. So I think there's one more slide. Is this is the slogan that we use for the Cache Game Area and Teton Pass, sustainable trails, respect for people, respect for land. We have this on all our sign things. It's probably the biggest challenge I think that we face. Say a couple of the challenges is the social conflict and social perceptions about different user groups. It's probably one of the hardest things to overcome, and really work on getting that understanding, and then coming together to really talk about what are we trying to protect. What are the specific values for one piece of ground, and given everyone's interest, how can we guide that use into the best location? And then the capacity issues are huge. It's the #1 issue that we're struggling with in the forest. Is the budgets are going way down, and so to try to do this work is, I've always believed, Leopold talked about this years ago, is that conservation can't be seen as just a government function. It's going to take all of us working together, and we've got to figure out how we come together to decide how we want to guide the use into the right location at the right time, and then figure out how we're going to generate the resources to do that. We struggle in Jackson because the parks are, the real focus, and a lot of money goes there, and a lot of people don't know that the National Forest, they think the National Forest is the park, and so they think we're getting the same money, and we aren't. So we really struggle with that. And what is our, how do we project the identity that the parks, we serve actually a complementary role, where the parks are serving more of the first-time visitor, and that's a lot of the tourist economy that certainly fills the restaurants and the hotels and things. But the National Forest is serving the community, and it's where people live, it's where they play, and that requires some investment too. So kind of struggling a little bit with that. Did mention, I think I forgot one point, is with the WSA is again, the Wyoming wilderness legislation did require that we have a certified boundary, and so that was the dispute. Really, it was in the paper, and I'm sure a lot of folks saw that, is it's one of only 4 pieces of legislation nationally that requires a map and certified boundary for the wilderness study areas as well as the designated wilderness. And so in 2012, we had a map that was with the legislation that said Palisades Wilderness Study Area, and that's what we thought was the official map. But Phil Hawker, who many people knew here, was intimately involved in passage of the Wyoming Wilderness Act, and he saw that map and said, you know, I don't think you're using the right map. And it took 2 years of, it was fascinating, honestly, but it took 2 years of research into all kinds of historical records to piece together the story of what happened with that. But out of that, there was some memos that said that the congressional committees wanted us to use the Rare 2 map that dated from '77. So the Palisades Wilderness Study Boundary has now been certified and approved, and it is closer to the 1977 Rare 2 map. And so it's much closer to the old Pass Road. But the controversy that I'm sure many of you saw is that there was a concern because of some of those downhill trails, whether they were in that area or not. We've always known that lithium was in the WSA, but the controversy was whether that power line jumps along that power line corridor under the power poles was also in the WSA. And that's what the controversy was about, that I'm sure many of you saw in the paper. But it turns out when we project all of that, it's just outside by about 20 feet. But that's, and so, you know, I think that one of the things that we've seen in terms of the WSA is that our forest plan does say that mountain biking is allowed in the WSA, and so it is legal. But again, in that 2004 decision, part of the reason that we put those downhill trails in the power line corridors and said you can put them here was to try to draw that use out of the WSA. And overall, because of the development of the mountain bike trails on the north side of the highway, like the Arrow Trail and the Phillips Ridge Trail, and those, is that we've seen less mountain bike use in the WSA because those trails are just so much fun and they're really accessible and things. And then the horse use, we're working really actively with backcountry horsemen to set up this area that, if we go back on one slide, this area here in the Wyoming range of Willow Creek near Hoback Junction. There's a great loop system in there, but again, it wasn't very well signed and not great trails, but we're working to fix those trails up to be a really quality day riding opportunity. There's a huge trailhead there and things, and so it's, if we can kind of draw some of the horse use there, and then the areas where we're trying to concentrate the mountain bike use, where we can really, we have the resources, it's good soils, is this cache game area right outside of Jackson, this area here, and that's where the decision that was released yesterday is we are adding, we're going to now have 2 trails that are separated use in that area, and they're just right on the edge of town, and there was a lot of conflict between hiking and biking, and so there's going to be some separated, there'll be, you know, some loop opportunities for a short loop for walking without any bike use. And at the same time, we're going to add a real critical connection that's called the Skyline Ridge that'll provide a longer loop for bikes and particularly trail running and hiking that's out along the ridge, but trying to kind of focus the use more in the near town and the riparian areas that are on the backside, keeping those a little bit more low key. And so again, it's this idea of trying to concentrate the use where you can manage it well, and provide the right opportunities at the right time. So that is a National Trails Day next Saturday. On the 6th is when when we'll start that separation of trails in the, right next to Jackson. So, and with Friends of Pathways leading that, and they've hired a youth corps this year, so 5 local kids are going to become a trail crew, mentored by our trail folks and things. So those are a few of the things that are going on. Hope that that's helpful. I think that one of the things is that the national direction is a real focus on sustainable recreation, and that's we look at that of what's, again, how do you sustain that from a resource standpoint? And the wildlife, the intersection between recreation and wildlife is becoming much more prominent, and again, driving a lot of our decisions. And then what's socially, again, really understanding what makes a quality trail system, and a shift from, it's not just about the number of miles of stuff, it's about the quality of what you got. And then the economic side of how does it intersect with the town and in helping with the local economy, as well as are people willing to invest in this system to make it happen? Without that investment from the community, this stuff is just not going to happen. And so we look at all 3 spheres when we're trying to figure this out. But none of our entire field program, there's not a single appropriated dollar going into any of this. So it entirely comes from, we're fortunate in having a very big outfitter guide program in Jackson, and so the fees that are retained under the Federal Land Recreation Enhancement Act are invested all back into the trail system and our field presence and all of that kind of things. Wilderness rangers, our entire wilderness program is based off of outfitter fees. I just hope that program never goes away. And then also a lot of grants and help from Wyoming State Trails, and they're a huge player in all this. So anyways, that's a little bit of what we're doing.